Hey, everybody, welcome to the Grow Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Kevin McNulty, and this is your personal development school of growth, where each week my guests and I will bring and break down big ideas and practices that will help you learn, grow, and succeed in life. Thanks for checking us out. Now let the growth begin. Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Grow Yourself, your personal development school of growth. Listen, for as long as I can remember, I'd say curiosity has been a guiding force in my life. It's really been a pillar of my life. I've lived by it. I've coached with it. I've seen how, for instance, the practice of curiosity, which is, or let me put it this way, that curiosity leads to good questions. And that's the second pillar of my life is that, and I'm saying really good question because I believe on a lot of levels, whether you're a leader who asks good questions, who interacts with colleagues and peers and subordinates with curiosity and asks really good questions. To me, that's the door to excellence. It's the door to a better life. It's a door to more purpose. But I will say for me, it is more than a skill. It's a way of moving through the world, in other words. That's, and by the way, that's why this quote from today's guest really, really resonates with me, and I think it's going to resonate with you. It goes as such. To me, being a Renaissance man means choosing growth through curiosity. It's about walking through the world with your eyes wide open, reading widely, listening deeply, asking better questions, not because you need all the answers, but because the pursuit changes you. Every book, every conversation, you pick, every skill that you pick up becomes a tool for building the best version of yourself. I mean, truly, what a profound quote in my way of thinking, and I couldn't agree with it more. Because curiosity and discipline, and the discipline of asking better questions have, as I said, been two pillars in my own journey. They have shaped how I learn, how I lead, how I connect with others, and a lot more. And so today we're going to explore that idea through the lens of somebody who embodies it, a modern day Renaissance man whose life and work span history, literature, music, craftsmanship, and more. We'll talk about how curiosity can shape not just what you know, but what you become. So, my guest, described as a Renaissance man, C.V. Wooster, has a deep passion for diverse subjects, seamlessly blending creativity, intellect, compassion in everything that he does. CV is an award-winning teacher with 25 years of classroom experience, a historian, a five-time best-selling author specializing in English literature, education, policy, political history. And I'm going to tell you, the, the you'll hear the titles of his book, and those by themselves just immediately provoke curiosity. Um, so his work it really highlights what we would say overlooked figures who quietly shaped history, inspired by childhood road trips along Route 66. CV has discovered Margaret Orcutt's story, a retired widow's bold stand against the government in the Mojave Desert, and reminded of his grandmother's fierce independence, he felt compelled to share Orcutt's story, a profoundly American tale. And so, I really just can't even wait to get. There's so much more to say about this man. I kid you not. He's pretty much done everything in life that one can do and still at a relatively young age. So if you would please welcome my special guest, CV Wooster. CV, thank you so much, man, for being with us on Grow Yourself.
Wow, you are welcome. You are now hired as my new press agent. I think that's fantastic. What
You
an
know,
opening. I appreciate that.
well, listen, it wouldn't take a press agent to impress anybody with your background, and we've had a chance to talk a couple of times, and it's truly fascinating, just from the
Mhm.
standpoint that some people let's just say, let's say post high school, go and focus on something. They become an engineer, they become a doctor, lawyer, they become work in a factory, whatever it is that they focus on. But it seems to me that C.V. Wooster decided to do many, many things, but all of them, which now create really, I would say, a very, maybe the most interesting guy in the world. So tell us a little bit, CV, before we get started about, here's the profound question I ask every guest. Who is
Mhm.
CV Wooster?
Well, first of all, you make me sound like the Dos Equis guy with the most interesting man in the
Well,
world. I'm honored
the
to be
thought
among
crossed,
that the
thought
higher
crossed my
echelon. I like that.
mind.
Not bad. So, got the beard, but I have to work on growing it out a little more
There
for
you
that. But
go.
no, who am I? I'm a kid who, grew up in a really adverse life and had a lot of trauma and struggles and so on, and didn't really have the best parentage in the world on especially on my father's side, and went ahead and, went through a lot of stumbles, a lot of falls, a lot of bad times, depression, and so on. And, through circumstance, sometimes being forced into change, sometimes enabling change. There's that Shakespeare quote, some men achieve greatness, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And, I wasn't born into, a life where I was simply going to go out and become, my life was pre-programmed of, you're going to become an engineer, as you mentioned, or something like that. I didn't have that kind of parental guidance. So, whether it's you're born into it or you achieve it or you have it thrust upon you, it's just a life that was kind of happenstance in many ways. It's a life where I sometimes went in one direction and wanted to go in a specific direction and didn't work out. And, I learned through circumstance and also through trial and error, which is how we all hopefully develop and grow, just like our muscles, we tear our muscles when we're working out in the gym or something like that, and it helps rebuild. And that's what happened. And I ended up in areas of my life that I never thought I would be. I never thought I'd be a writer at this age. I'm 60 now and publishing a book and having it become very successful. A few years ago, even was not something that was on my radar map. Yeah, I thought, well, maybe I should write a book someday, but
Yeah,
in an abstract thought. But I never actually, put it in anything in a paper, so to speak. So yeah, I went through life and I became uh did all sorts of different jobs. I was a musician for a while, a drummer, and I played bass and guitar and
wow.
did a lot of shows and gigs, and I was a building contractor. I became a carpenter and worked my way up through the trades and eventually got my license and started to do building and remodels and things like that. Um, I kind of got tired of that because it's kind of a young man's game. It's hard on your body.
Yeah,
And I transitioned into teaching, and even that was just happenstance. I had
yeah,
a catalog, college, junior college catalog came in the mail one day and said, "Why don't you go back to school and get your degree?" And so I did, but I had no idea I was going to become a teacher. I just wanted to finish off and get a degree. And then when I was in college, I had a teacher that came up to me and said, "You should be teaching," and I thought, "Really? Me?" And he's like, "Yeah, you."
interesting.
And it changed my life.
Yeah. Well, I know
So.
that you and we talked about this before. You've put a lot of focus, a lot of time into young people, not just necessarily in the classroom, but I think beyond that in sort of a mentorship role. But before we kind of move into some of that, um, and before I ask you how you define a Renaissance man, or let's, for the purpose of this podcast, we call a Renaissance man a Renaissance person because obviously it can be a man or a woman. But let me ask you, CV, about growing up. So were you raised, you're in Southern California now, and were you raised in Southern California?
I was born and raised in Los Angeles, yeah.
Wow. And so do you recall when you were a young kid, what was your mind like? What were you like? Were you the kid that was always observing people, or were you a kid that was, had social anxieties? I mean, sort of, could you describe what your mindset was like as a kid? It might be hard to do, but I'm just
Well,
curious.
no, it's actually not. I was always an adult because of the circumstances that
Hmm.
I was raised in.
Yeah.
And when you're a child of trauma and you have, a modicum of intelligence, you start to take on a very adult role because your parents are not being parents.
Got it.
They're acting like children. So it became an inverse relationship.
I see.
So even at a very young age, I was a lot more stoic. I was very quiet. There was a lot of going on inside, obviously. I didn't quite have the wherewithal to, handle a lot of the adult responsibilities. I wasn't going to go out and start refinancing a house at 6 years old, those types of things, obviously. But when it came to a lot of the emotional regulation, I was the one that was able to control my emotions and so on. And, it became a necessity, unfortunately. So I didn't have the traditional childhood. I'm always
Hmm.
fascinated, and I think it's wonderful. When I hear stories of, when I was growing up and my mom and dad, and they took me on a trip to the Grand Canyon, and then we went to Europe the next summer, and they were doing all these kind of enrichment, cultural activities to raise their kid, which they should be doing. I had none of that. So I don't,
Wow.
that is a foreign world to me. So even
Interesting.
when people talk to
Yeah.
me about it at 60, and even when I hear, students of mine who's, I ask them what they did during the summer, and they tell me some of these things that they did, I'm a little, still a little, I won't say shocked, but it's kind of like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
oh, that
Yeah.
happened. Okay.
Yeah. And we might say, because I think I mentioned to you that I coach a middle school tennis team. It's one of the great joys in my life, but I encourage these young kids. I encourage them to do things, and some might say, okay, well, maybe you don't have the money to go to Europe or even to the Grand Canyon, but it doesn't take a lot for a parent to do interesting things for their
Exactly.
kids, right?
Yeah, take them for a picnic, take them for a walk on the beach and show them seashells. Turn it into a hybrid activity, whether it's, science related or history, take them to a museum. It's not that I didn't do anything,
No,
but I
no, I
grew up,
understand.
divorced.
Yeah.
My parents were divorced I was 9 months old when my parents were divorced. So I
Mm,
primarily grew up with my mother, my grandmother, and my older sister who was 5 years old,
mm.
older than me. And, we would go away and do little Saturday day trip type things. We would go to a museum or something like that, and especially if it was tied into a school thing where it was an activity that they, that asked us to do.
Mhm.
Go to one of the things that they do in California, for instance, they used to do, I don't know so much than they do is, go to one of the California missions, that were started and, write a report. So you'd take a day trip to, Mission San Juan Capistrano and you tour around and then you come back and
Yeah.
write a little book report type, type thing on it.
So,
So
so
we
let
did
me
things
ask
like
though,
that,
why
but
didn't it go wrong? Why didn't your life go wrong because of a
well,
difficult
it
upbringing?
did,
Oh, it did? Okay.
it did go wrong. Yeah. I got into alcohol pretty heavy.
Gotcha.
I was never a druggie or anything like that. That didn't really
Mhm.
interest me. I was much more into, at the time, even at an early age, I was into writing and poetry and things like that. And, to
Okay.
me at the time in my own rationalization was, all the poets were great drunks,
Hmm.
so, I thought, well, why not be like them,
Hmm.
type thing.
Yeah.
And, and all the great writers,
Yeah.
even, you take Hemingway and it doesn't matter, and, to somebody who wasn't parented right, it sounded like a grand idea at the time, which
Yeah.
obviously was, not a great idea. But, it was not my life's plan to go down that road. I did go down that road,
Hmm.
and I lived to tell about it. I
Yeah.
didn't end up getting arrested. I didn't end up going to, to jail or doing anything stupid or anything like that, luckily.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of failed relationships that, because of
Okay.
just not knowing who I was, a lot of insecurity. So yeah,
Okay.
it was not a rise up.
Okay. So one last question, then I'm gonna ask you about the Renaissance thing. So you graduated from high school. What did you do then? Did you go, okay, now what? Did you just kind of look around and say, okay, now what? Or can you recall that the the first trajectory that you took after you graduated from high school? Sort
As
of the,
far as
yeah,
growth or as
yeah,
far
or anything. I mean, what was the first move that you made after high school? Did you go to work or did you just hang out and party? Or I
Well,
mean,
it wasn't, yeah, no, it was one of those things. I didn't have a lot of friends.
okay.
So, I had occasionally had a girlfriend and stuff like that. But, a lot of it was about comments. I've had this theme that's gone through my life where somebody has made a random comment that is completely, almost innocuous to them. They would never say anything if I ever referenced it and said, "Do you remember when you said this 5 years ago?" And they're like, "No, I don't remember." To me, it was
Mm.
like this billboard moment. And I had, certain billboard moments where somebody said something to me, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, a moment of clarity.
Yeah.
And, I was dating a woman, when I was a young girl, when I was in my 20s, and, I was spiraling down, and said something to me about, I couldn't be with you because of the way you are, and the way your life is
Oh,
projected. And,
wow.
I'm looking for, and it was a hard
Sure.
reality to get slapped in the
Sure.
face. And then there's even if it wasn't somebody that I personally knew, but in the 1980s there was a journalist named Bill Moyers who'd been around forever,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he passed
I'm
away
familiar.
recently.
Hmm.
And he used to do a show, an interview show on PBS, and it was he interviewed a guy named Joseph Campbell, and he had a book out called The Power of Myth at the time. And Campbell wrote this legendary book about taking all the mythology from different cultures and kind of synthesizing it and talking about the common themes of, you know, things like Gilgamesh, and then, bringing it into different religions and so on, and other, mythology, Greek mythology, and so on. But he made this quote, and he said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek."
Oh, goodness
And
gracious.
I was just like, somebody just hit me in the head with a sledgehammer, because
Hmm.
it wasn't something that I immediately seized on and went, okay, I'm gonna go start entering all these different caves. But it resonated since the 80s with me, where I've literally looked at it and said, there's an area of my life I'm not getting into for whatever I'm
Yeah.
fearing, but that's where they're going. Even you and I talking today, this is not my norm. I'm happy being in front of people. I don't have a
Sure.
problem talking. I teach every day. I've done the Zoom teaching even. I've been in all sorts of things like that. But to have this kind of podcast interview, I've done several of these now,
Mm.
the book's out, but I'm still learning my way,
Yeah, I
you
get it.
know.
I get
I'm
it.
born into this kind of, broadcasting type of thing. And, learning to be vulnerable and share, that's a cave that there was a time in my life where I was afraid to enter. But, the treasure you seek, as Campbell said. So you and I talked, as you mentioned, off air, a while back. And, my maxim is to leave people better than when I found them. So when
Yeah.
I leave you today, I leave your viewers, anybody who's listening, I want them to be a better person and go, oh, okay, maybe something in my story inspires them. Maybe there's something innocuous that I said that I, will forget about, but to them, they'll remember
Yeah.
30 years later too. I don't know, and that's the cool thing about just being alive and being, uh, a person of experience, and that
There
stuff
are
you learn.
so many nuggets in what you just said. The first thing was the billboard idea, and I want I want my viewers, if you will, to hear these things and whether it's good for them or not. Like for instance, again, I coach a middle school tennis team, just had our first practice last night, and I'm listening. I'm listening to the things that you're saying that I can pass on to them. This idea of the cave. I think as a kid, and I suspect maybe the same for you, that if I were to walk past that cave, I would probably go, "Oh crap, that's spooky," but I'm curious. I gotta see what's in there. I think I would have still went in there because just out of curiosity. And so without pushing any analogy or metaphor too far, I encourage people just at least get close to the cave. Just take a peek and see what's in there. You've probably heard of the allegory of the cave by Plato. That was a big,
Mhm.
big billboard for me. I mean, I was already a young man at the time when I first read it. But it can mean a lot of things. And for people who don't know, the allegory of the cave, you should go look it up. So I'm not going to really spend much time because I want to hear from CV. But the allegory of the cave is basically about some people that were facing a wall and they were all in chains tied up and they couldn't move. And there were these figures that were going back and forth on the wall. Well, they were shadows of something behind them, but they grew up. They've been in front of this wall all their life, so they had no context or nothing to compare or contrast it with. Well, briefly, as the story goes along, one person was able to break out of the chains and decided to, and turned around and saw that there was something happening behind him. And so he starts to walk out of the cave, realizing that this is, some people walking back and forth with rocks, moving rocks or something like this. But then he looked up and he saw the light coming from outside of the cave and wondered what that was. And so my point behind this story, again, people should go look it up. It's quite compelling. When I read that's that allegory, I said to myself, part of what I believe Plato's describing here is to go seek the light. From where does that shadow come from? That the shadow is just something that you imagine, but the reality of what's making the
Yeah.
shadow is more real than the shadow
Yeah.
itself. And all of these sorts of things. So when
Well,
you mentioned the cave, that's the first thing that jumped into my head was the allegory of the cave.
first of all, I urge everybody to go read Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth. That book
Love that.
is just unbelievable because it explains so much about, where
Mm-hmm.
we are as a world at any given time because we're always adding to our mythology. We're even creating AI myths now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, the allegories that you mentioned and other allegories like that are important because and last because they're so universal. They're
Mm-hmm.
universal truths,
That's right.
and we as individuals, are most people, maybe you are different and maybe I'm different now. I certainly wasn't when I was earlier in life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, most people do not want to take on the challenge. Life is comfortable, life is easy. I'm making my paycheck, I'm doing whatever it is, and I'm getting by on the bare minimum. I have dreams, I have hopes, but if I write that book or if I start that podcast or if things might go wrong and whatever it is, people might not like my book and then I'll be, and it becomes this kind of doom and gloom thing, and I get it. It makes sense to one part of the human brain. But again, if you don't take a risk in life, which is what Campbell was talking about with the cave, you're just going to live your same life over and over again, being unfulfilled, and again, we use it in the, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all type thing, so you either fall in love and get it over out of your system type thing, better than just sit there
Yeah.
and wonder about, what's it
Yeah.
like to be in love.
Yeah.
And, all these are the same recurring theme, just recycled. Euripides talked about, you have, you have, you have pain basically because it loosely translates from the ancient Greek, but you have pain. That's because you had grief. You hurt. People hurt, but that's because you had grief at some point in time, and you need to get past that point, and it's difficult. A lot of people won't
Yes.
get therapy. A lot of people will suffer in silence. A lot of
Yeah.
people will sit there and grouse and complain because,
Yeah.
again, it is the easy way out because success is challenging. It's not
Yeah.
easy for me, for instance, to write a book,
Yeah.
but there are parts of it that I really love. There's parts of it I can't stand writing. It's
Yeah.
like I love the research aspect of it, but I can't stand like book formatting and
Yeah.
putting everything perfectly on the page and
Hmm.
citations and doing those that gets on my nerves. Okay. I don't like little tedium type jobs. I'm not good with Excel spreadsheets and things like that. I couldn't be a person who worked on spreadsheets all
Yeah.
day.
God
But
blows
there's
the
people out there who love that
mhm.
kind of stuff and
Yeah.
good for them. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's other people who
Yeah.
look at me and go, "How could you sit in a dusty library and look at old documents?"
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Oh my God, that's like
Yeah.
manna from heaven. That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
What a great opportunity." So we all have our own
Yeah.
strengths and weaknesses, but I urge everybody, and I know your podcast is all about this, which is why I'm so, happy to be here. Go live your life.
God,
I
man.
hate to slap people upside the head and be blunt, but that's what it takes. And if you
Yeah.
don't have the skills, you don't know where to go, take a baby step.
Yes.
When I started writing a book, I read a book years ago, way before the internet even. It was called If You Can Think, You Can Write,
Hmm.
which was a great title for a book, and I don't even remember the author, but everybody has a story in them. So go tell your
Yeah.
story. Even if you're not going to write a book, start a podcast, start your own
Yeah.
YouTube channel, do whatever, start your own blog, and then you're going to fail. You're going to fail so many times, but failure is where the growth is. You may go into a cave and that cave doesn't quite have the treasure you wanted, but it may have some kind of think of it as an abstract treasure. It may not be the pot of gold there sitting for you, but there may be a little writing on the wall on the side of the cave, and you're like, oh, okay, there's a direction of where I'm supposed to go from this cave to the next cave or whatever it is. And you
Mm,
start picking up this breadcrumb trail and you start moving along in life and, making the choice. But it all starts with a
yeah,
conscious choice for change.
yeah.
And that's the problem because we're not, and quickly, I don't mean to interrupt, but you and I talked off air about mentoring. And that's when, with your coaching and my teaching, people today, kids today, and and for decades really have not had solid mentors,
Mhm,
and that's one of the problems because
mhm.
I figured out a lot of the stuff on my own. Occasionally, I ran across somebody in life who really stepped in and said, now, here's what you need to do. But a lot of people don't want to invest the time on the mentor side.
Yeah,
A lot of people on the mentee side, they don't want to stick
yeah,
with it. I've
that's right.
tried to mentor a lot of people who simply quit,
Yeah,
and I get it,
yeah.
but it's like, then they'll complain later,
Yeah, but you're so right. And as we talked about, I have a mentor now. I've had a mentor all my life. I was lucky enough, let me just say, I was blessed enough, I say by God, that he did give me this curiosity factor, this curiosity factor, and then the practice of asking questions. And so my curiosity alone led me to mentors, just even if it was a momentary mentor. CV, how did you do that? That's, so you see, I mean, just that alone, but to have a mentor throughout your life is an incredibly great thing to do. And I will just add and maybe ask actually one more thing to, you know, if you could put it into some sort of a practice for our viewers. So this idea of billboard moments, I think that is tremendous. I immediately understood what you meant. Can you, share from your perspective now, here, you know, this many years later, how do they put that idea into practice to pay attention to the billboards or whatever, however you'd like to say it? I'd love for people to know this. I think it's very important.
Well, in the last, I would say 15, 20 years, there's been a big focus on something called mindfulness. There's even, apps that
Yep.
you can download that will be more about being more mindful.
Yep.
You just have to make a conscious choice. If people say, well, I can't do that. Look, you can do anything in the world that you want to if you put your mind to it. And, otherwise it's just excuse making. And people don't want to hear that. They want to be, there's a lot of victimology out there. I can't do that because my book won't sell and people won't like it and people won't watch my podcast. People won't do, I tried to help somebody start a business that they wanted and it was a good business and they were very talented at what they did. And all I heard about was the negatives. Well, then I'll have to get involved in filing taxes and I'll have to get doing this and then I have to, start going places and trying to shop my stuff and getting into stores. And it's like, yeah, and there's your cave right there.
Yeah, it is.
Maybe if you do that, you will have become a success, and all of a sudden your product will become legendary in the market. But nobody's going to know if as they said in the kind of in the biblical text, hiding it under a bushel. You're not gonna do any kind of thing in life if you take your light and hide it. And you and I again, we talked about that amazing quote. I sent you the link to it, the Marianne Williamson quote, which I have it on my wall. It's called Our Deepest Fear. And I urge everybody to go look up the Marianne Williamson quote, Our Deepest Fear. And, it talks about how our deepest fear is, not that we're, oh gosh, I should pull it up in front. Maybe you haven't pulled it up in front or shared or something like with people.
Yeah,
But that
that's it.
is that is one of the most beautiful quotes about how we all hide our own fear and we don't want to become anything more. And, it asks, who are we not to do this? You can sit trying to figure
Yeah.
out, well, why should I become somebody better? Well, why not you?
Yeah.
Why not
Yeah.
Kevin start a podcast and try to help people? Why not Kevin and myself talk online about
That's
human
right.
growth and potential,
That's right.
because
That's
who
right.
knows where, maybe this
Yeah.
episode gets 30
Yeah.
people to watch, maybe it gets 300,000 people to watch.
Yeah.
And again, maybe somebody's life gets touched.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
you nailed it when you said, when you mentioned about mindfulness. And in fact, just a couple of episodes ago, I did one on mindfulness, had a former Hindu monk who turned into a leadership coach. Very interesting idea, but spot on about what you said. And let me just offer this short anecdote. This happened many years ago, and it goes to the point of watching the billboards. It's not quite the same thing, but it lends itself to that. So I recall I had some business in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Coming back from Chattanooga to Nashville, you have to climb up a mountain a little bit, on a big, busy, 4 or 5 lane highway or something like this. So I'm driving, I'm coming around a curve, and I see a young person, young lady, turns out to be a college. She was in college down in Chattanooga. She was over to the side, and she was just, you could just see she was in complete fear. She had broken down, this, that, and the other. I saw her as I went by, could see her crying. I went on by and then decided to pull over, but I was probably, a few 100 feet away or something. So I had to back down the side of this road to get back to her. And here's what happened very quickly. So I'm really paying attention to my mirror over here because there's so many cars coming past me in the right lane. But I'm looking at my rear view mirror and really focused on this one here so nobody ran me, would bump into me or I wouldn't go out into the road. As I'm backing up, CV, it just at the corner of my eye, I saw this water gushing out of the side of the mountain into the whatever the side of the highway there. That's all it was. I didn't say anything. It looked like a fair amount of water, but it was also tucked away a little bit inside of the foliage, if you will. And it didn't make me go stop and go, oh wow, or anything. I just saw it. I kept going back, and I went back and then was in front of her car. I got out, and she said she was crying. She says, my car's broken down, it's smoking and all this stuff. And she had her hood open. We went over, looked at it, and it was obvious that she was out of water in her radiator. And, you know, of course, the first thing that came to me was she said, I don't have anything. I said, do you have any bottles or anything like that? She goes, yes. We walked up to this stream and just filled the bottles up with water and went back and filled her up. I only bring that point up because it's not the same thing as billboards in life, but things are happening around you. There's clues from whomever you'd like to say, from me, it's God, but however you'd like to say it, there are billboards around you. And the idea is to pay attention, take notice of them. And like you and like me and many others, you know, once you make the decision, as you
Well,
said, you start to see the billboards. They're there.
you do, and that has been proved over and over again in psychological tests. Where people will, I can't. There used to be a name for the effect, but let's say they talk about a certain type of car, and then all of a sudden you see that car all over the
Mm,
place. It's the
exactly.
same thing. When you start to do something that blesses somebody else, like getting the water for this woman and helping her with her car. And she may have been the most non-car person, could barely put gas in the tank, whatever. Okay.
As I am.
That type of stuff. Yeah. And that type of stuff ends up, changing her life,
Mhm.
but it now opens you as an individual up to other things that you're going to see, as well as opening her up to human kindness and
That's right.
compassion.
That's
And
right.
it costs nothing.
Costs
Yeah,
nothing.
maybe it was a little bit of your time to stop and,
Mhm.
maybe it's 20 minutes out of your day, whatever it
Yep.
took. But so what? You change some because what happens if you driven by and that woman had the next person that came by was somebody who had, you know, negative
Nefarious
intents,
intentions.
they
Yeah,
were
yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
rapist,
yeah.
a murderer, something
Hmm.
like that,
Yep.
and pretty soon you're now living a life of regret, thinking, God, if I'd only stopped and this woman would still be alive.
Yeah.
We don't know that. So,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that we all need to go out and suddenly, throw ourselves out there and do every single kind thing possible and you know, give to people who are constantly biting our hand. We have to be judicious about that kind of stuff, but we have to be aware of the opportunities.
Yeah.
And, again, it gets back to
Yeah.
the maxims, stop and smell the flowers.
Yeah.
When you stop in life and you smell the flowers and you admire them instead of just walking by them,
Yeah.
you start to appreciate nature better, and then things
Yeah.
open up in that context also.
Hmm.
So, but I just pulled up the Marianne Williamson quote. It says, "Our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure.
Ugh.
It's our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You're a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world." And she goes on. And, that's pretty much life encompassed. Who
Hmm.
are you not to do whatever life it
Hmm.
is thing that you want to do, whether it's write a book, become an actor, start your own business. And again, I don't care what it is that you want to do, because we all have our own talents. Not everybody wants to be a writer, not everybody wants to be a podcaster, not everybody wants to be a teacher, but you got some kind of talent, you know. So,
That's
you
powerful,
know,
man. Super powerful.
yeah.
So CV, let's move on to the idea of the Renaissance man. Can you first just define in your own way how you would define a Renaissance man or a Renaissance person if we want to make it, neutral?
Sure. Well, first of all, start, as kind of a teacher, because when in the classroom, you always start with the concept that maybe not everybody's ever heard of the Renaissance man. So for those who may be younger and haven't experienced or heard of something, but a Renaissance man back in the days of the Renaissance in Europe were, men who were interested in all sorts of, and could be women too, who were interested in science and literature and art and languages and all these different types of things.
Yeah.
And, it's fine if you want to specialize. If you're a science person and that's all you want to do is be a nuclear physicist and your whole world is all about that, or, if my world was all about writing, which it's not, but, then that's fine. But, I'm interested in a lot of things. I'm not a genre-based writer. I don't write in fantasy or just do history books. I write in all sorts of things because I'm interested in all sorts of things.
Mm.
I'm writing a math book, which I'm not a math teacher, but I find what's called, recreational mathematics interesting. So I read a book called The Recreational Mathematician, because they're little brain exercises and they're fascinating, And so when you begin to look at the world and say, I'm interested in this and I'm interested in this, and I like to play tennis and I like to listen to music, or I want to learn to play guitar, or I want to do whatever it is you want to do. I want to learn how to become the world's best plumber. I don't care, go do whatever rocks your world, because their world needs plumbers, but becoming interested in the world around you in every facet. And it's fine to specialize. I think it's
Yeah.
great for those
Yeah.
people who do.
Yeah.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
I literally cannot try to,
Yeah.
because the minute I start focusing on one thing, I'm suddenly thinking, and sometimes when I'm working on a project, a writing project, I've got, you know, the topic itself takes me off on a tangent. It's like going on Wikipedia. You start to read an article, and pretty soon you're clicking on 15 other links in the
That's
Wikipedia
right.
article to go off on these tangential things,
Yeah.
So be curious in life, There's nothing wrong with being curious about all sorts of
Yeah.
things. And not knowing is one of the best motivators. It bothers me when I don't know something. So then I have to go out and I have to find out about it. When I was doing, stuff about book marketing, for instance. I had no clue. I know how to write a book, but I wasn't good. So it took me down a whole rabbit hole of how book marketing works today and how it's evolved over the last few years and how it's now with AI, it's even changing even again, and it'll keep going through, iterational shifts. So yeah, be curious, but don't be afraid that you don't know something. Be the stupid guy in the room.
Yeah.
Ask questions, like I don't know this. What do it's your
Yeah.
expertise. I mean, I don't know anything about making a podcast, okay? You do. So if I want to come pick your brain and say, Kevin, yeah, how did you set up your signal path on your microphone, and what kind of effects did you use to get the right tone and whatever it is, which, are you using Zoom? Are you using whatever? I go to somebody who knows that kind of stuff. Okay. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that I don't know, and I'm happy to find them out. But people fear that too.
Yes,
They fear
you're right.
finding out.
They
I'm
fear.
afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
So
Well, and
what?
you're
You know?
leading me to my next thought about becoming a Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman. For one, and I'm asking this, I'll state it, but I'm asking this.
Sure.
You don't have to become this broad and shallow person, or You don't have to be focused and deep and wide. So a Renaissance person, I think about, and I can't think of the person right off the top of my head. It might be Vivek Ramaswamy. I'm not sure, but I believe he's, but it fascinates me. Oh, no, I can't think of her name right now. She was a former Secretary of State, but she's
Haley
this,
or
Kagan?
not Nikki Haley.
No, no, no,
No,
no, no, no, no.
no, Nikki Haley was UN.
Yeah, black woman. I think she worked for Bush.
Oh,
Uh,
Condoleezza
Condoleezza
Rice.
Rice. So she's a very highly, like professional, somewhat stoic looking, just
Yeah,
really
and
like very
she's
articulate and just,
brilliant
academic,
classical pianist.
brilliant classical pianist. And that's my point. And when I
Uh,
saw her sitting down and playing
uh,
piano, there's others like this. It completely changed
yeah.
my perspective of her. I was like, wow, that's cool. And so that's so one, let me just say that you don't have to be interested in everything. Perhaps like you, I am interested in everything. I have to learn how to control myself. But at the same time, it's also not just for the young person, the young budding person. A person today at 60, 70 can still take on the attitude and practical, and
Well,
practical
and you mentioned the
practices
key
of being a
word right
Renaissance
there.
person. Please.
Yeah, you mentioned the key word attitude. You know, your attitude determines your altitude. And again, all these maxims and quotes and
Hmm.
truisms in life, they're there because they're
Hmm.
right. You know,
Yeah.
I just recently went through a very severe cardiac event and I ended up having surgery.
Oh
And
my.
I'm very healthy right now. I went through cardiac rehab for 36 sessions and graduated my cardiac rehab thing. And I'm very proud of all that kind of stuff. And, this was recently in May of, this year, 2025. And at the time that it happened, I didn't know if I'd be alive. I was like, it was pretty serious. Now I'm here talking to you and I'm able to now take that experience of life and pay it forward, so to speak, which,
Mhm.
we talked about before offline too. And, there's hope, but my attitude in getting through rehab and just surviving and becoming a better person, eating better, exercising more, and taking care of myself. All of that stuff had to do with attitude. I could have easily quit rehab, physical rehab, not, alcohol rehab or something like that, but physical rehab that I had to go through. But I had to go through and really there were days it was like, I can't do this 5 days a week. I mean, it was just crushing me, it was exhausting.
Yeah, it's
But
a
I
lot.
did it and I made it through. And, that now is making me feel more energetic. And, I mean, I woke up this morning and bounded out of bed. I was like, I'm going to do this podcast and this is so cool. And I enjoyed our conversation that you and I had, last week. And, it's an opportunity. I mean, the fact that I am able to sit in front of you and your viewers or the world right now conceivably. And what is up here is now broadcast out to all of those people. And I am my own little personal broadcast station from, transmitting from right here. And all of my ideas, my concepts, my theories, my philosophies, whatever it is, are getting out there. What a blessing to be, in this position. And anybody could do it. I mean, you and
Yes.
I met, and it's just inside baseball, but there's websites where you can list yourself as a podcast guest, and if you have a podcast, it matches people. It's I won't say a dating profile for people, but it works kind of in that way. You match up, and you contacted me and said, "Hey, I found your profile on this podcast website, and I think you'd be a great guest." And I'm like, "Fantastic!" So we chatted about it, make sure we were a right fit, and wonderful.
Yeah.
You know.
Interesting about that, CV, to the point that we're talking about here is when I read that, and I actually picked very few from the site that you're on because I'm really trying to, focus in on certain topics. But when I saw you and read your profile, I remember saying to myself, I have no idea what I would want to talk to this guy about, but he just sounds so
Mhm.
interesting. I'm sure we'll find maybe many things. But again, two things.
Thank
One,
you.
you presented yourself as a very interesting person, and I read these things as a very curious person. And that's how the two things matched up. And
Well,
yeah.
First of all, let me say you're a good interviewer.
Thank you.
Okay. I mean, you really are. You ask relevant questions. They're intelligent and well thought out and so on. And you are generally curious, and all the people who've interviewed me, a lot of them I do off, they're just audio call in where I don't do the video and so on. These people are generally curious,
Mm,
and some people ask better questions, but, that's okay. We're all learning on this journey. If I
hope
started out
so.
doing a podcast, I'd probably ask some pretty abominable questions and,
Hmm.
learn my way. But,
Hmm.
it's a good conversational flow.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking, you know, this is, we'd mentioned this, or I mentioned this earlier last time we talked too. This is like jazz, versus classical. This is free form flow. We're just
You
kind
got
of
it.
bantering back and forth and get off in different tangential things. And it's, classical music is more aspirational. It's like, this is what I want to be, and, so
Good
this
point.
kind of thing really works well. And I think it's
Yeah.
a good fit. And I'm having a blast doing these things. I
Well,
love it. A few
well,
years ago, by the way, I would never want to do this.
hmm,
I would never want to be broadcast all over. I would
hmm,
not because I didn't think I had anything to say, but
hmm.
I wasn't ready. And that's another point that, with being a Renaissance man and so on, you may encounter things that you're not ready for,
That's right.
but you took them away in your head.
Mm.
And, like, a chance to hawk my book, Mrs. Orcutt's Driveway, wherever it is here.
Yeah,
I don't know
it's
if you can
blanking
see it,
out, but
but
I'm going to ask you all about
blank
those.
it out.
Yes. Hmm.
Yeah. But one of the books there, um, I saw that story, cataloged it in my brain, and I wasn't ready to write it. And then a few years later, boom, it popped back into my head, and I went, now I'm ready to write it.
Wow.
So, you know,
So let's talk about your books. Not just that one, but we'll
Mhm.
start with that one. That's your current book. It's a fascinating. I haven't had to read chance to read your books, but I really am gonna take the time to read that one and others that just the titles in and of themselves just are fascinating. And so we can't get too deep into all of them. I would love for you to spend a little time
Sure.
on your first on the one that we're going to talk about now. I don't know. Can you try to put it in front of the camera again now and hold it still right in front of you so people can kind of see it? It kind of
I don't
blanks.
know if
There
you
it is
can
right
see
there.
it
Yes,
here.
yes, you can see it now. No, when you move it like
Mine
that, keep it in
glitches
front of you.
out.
There you go.
Yeah.
Mrs. Orcutt's driveway. Oh, that's fascinating. So
Right.
tell us about that uh, series.
Well, Mrs. Orcutt was a widow. She
True
lived a
story,
widow in
right?
her life. True story, 100% true. And she was a woman born in 1909. She died in 1986. And she was from Indiana. She moved to Los Angeles, they met her husband. They got married, lived in LA for a while. And then when her husband passed away, she moved to Newberry Springs, California, which is in the Mojave Desert. And it is desolate. It's like living in the Sahara Desert. It's windy, sandy, very inhospitable. And this was during the 1950s.
Mm,
And she buys this property, and one day the government comes in 1960s, early 1960s, and there's a notice saying that they're going to build an interstate. And they did not navigate the interstate well, and they literally designed the interstate to go straight through part of her property. And they cut off her road access to Route 66 because her house was in one area and Route 66 was, not too far away, wasn't a huge drive. And they put this interstate right through the middle and cut her. So she now had no way to get to Route 66 or town. So she started writing letters to the congressman and the governor and everything, to try and, Caltrans and, all these different agencies that were involved protesting basically. I want access to, the city where you're cutting off my road. And, it became an eminent domain thing for a while with the government was threatening eminent domain. And she starts this old, typewriter campaign in the 50s, way before, we had computers and printers and things like that. And one by one, writing out these letters. And she eventually writes to Lady Bird Johnson in 1964. She writes to Lyndon Johnson when he's president. And she, he wasn't, the one to have caused the problem, but she reached out to him as help, saying, this is what's going on. And eventually, the government, without seemingly, from the story that I've been able to research, seemingly without any lawyers, the government agrees to her terms that she get a road built specifically for her. And according to legend, they gave her two options. We can either build you an overpass over the interstate that will go strictly to your house, or we can build you a road that will go from your house down to the next overpass. And, I cover it in the book, and she chose the road because she didn't really want access, from an overpass going, people get off the overpass and everybody ends up at her house type thing.
Yeah.
Um, but the problem was the next overpass was 4.1 miles away. So the government ends up building her a 4.1 mile driveway that goes only from her house to the overpass, and it is her property. It's still there today. She fought the government. She won. The government paid for it. And, people can drive by, they can drive on it. It's private property still. It's never been owned by the county. It's not owned by the state. It's not anything that has to do with, a protected, historical landmark, although I'd like to see something like that done.
Sure.
But, it's the quintessential David versus Goliath story. It is
Wow.
her going up against the common person, going up against the government, and then winning, and she did it without a lawyer. She did it with a typewriter, and she did it on her own. And she, again, was a widow living in an adobe house that she built herself with a little bit of help. And when I first heard the story, I thought, oh, it's great that she wrote to the president and all this. Is it really true? Well, I found the letters, and it turns out that she really did. I went to the Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, and they
That
actually
is
found the letter. They didn't even know they had them, and they found them. They're like, oh wow, this is great, So,
crazy.
but she wins, but I thought that was the whole story. It turns out her whole life before then, and even some of her life after, because she lives about another 20 years or so after this whole thing, because it kind of happens. The main part of the story is 64 to 66. Her life was fascinating. And it was, so I fell in love with her as a character. And I really wanted to, hop in a time machine and go back to 1964 Mojave Desert in Newberry
Goodness
Springs and meet her.
gracious.
She's,
How
but
did you come across her name or her story or whatever?
well, when you grew up in Los Angeles, my uncle used to live in Arizona, and we would go across the desert. And you'd hear a story back in the 70s and
Mm.
stuff like that about it. Was this lady who lived out here somewhere that had this, and you just kind of catalog and you forget about
Yeah.
it. And then years later, I was I'd had shoulder surgery and rotator cuff, and I was recuperating at home, and I was sitting around watching a lot of YouTube and stuff, and I found out that there were people who YouTube recommended this video that somebody did a vlog on Mrs. Orca's driveway, and it was somebody who went out to the property and talked about it for 15 minutes and took a bunch of video and they gave a lot of factual stuff. Some of it was a little, off, but they didn't know at the time. So I thought, well, it's somebody ought to write a book. So then I looked up to see it because I assumed somebody had written a
You
book.
saw the
Yeah,
billboard.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
the billboard, but I
You
also
write it.
thought, well, maybe somebody else saw the billboard too, and maybe they've already written a book.
Right.
And it
Right.
turns out nobody had written the story down. And I thought, what a
Unbelievable.
loss. And then I cataloged it because I was still recuperating and life went on.
Yeah.
And then about a year ago, a little over a year ago, it popped back into my head again. And I thought, yeah, the universe, God, whatever it is telling me that you've got to tell her story.
Do it.
So I thought I have no idea how to tell this woman's story because there were sparse um, records. There's nothing left over. She didn't have any kids. And so there were no, family documents. I wasn't able to go into somebody's attic and start, going through boxes of old letters and things like that. And it just became this. The reason the book took almost a little over a year was because it was just, I kept hitting dead end after dead end, but then I hit these successes like with the Johnson Library and so on. And it just became this amazing thing. And I ended up
Yeah.
getting a hold of some people who actually knew her, that were able to contribute. And Margaret Orcutt is every one of us. If you've, I mentioned this on a recent interview I did, if you've ever stood in line at the DMV and gone up against the power structure, you've had to deal with, the IRS or paying your property taxes, and there's issues with the state or your local government, whatever it is, that's what her story was all
That
about.
is
But
just,
she is a legend. I mean, she is truly a
yeah.
legend. And the videos that these vloggers have done, they're amazing vloggers. I was going to do a little mini documentary for the book, and I'm still planning on doing that, but I'm working on too many other things to do. But um, these things have millions of views. You go on, type in Mrs. Orca's driveway on YouTube, and some of these videos
Yeah.
have millions. views of, people are fascinated with the story.
Wow.
So the book's
Wow.
been really well received. It won a Literary Titan Award. And again, as you mentioned earlier, it became a five-time bestseller in different Amazon categories. I think the thing I was most proud of myself was in the 1960s history category, it became number one, which
Wow.
only for me, maybe other people, I'm not trying to be impressive, but I impressed the hell out of myself. It beat Bill O'Reilly book, Killing Kennedy, and it beat Dolores Kearns Goodwin, who is a presidential historian. She's like 83 years old, but
Yeah, I'm
she
familiar with
worked,
that
she
name.
knew Johnson, worked in the Johnson administration back in the day. And I went at one point in time, or Mrs. Orchis Drive was number one, and Dolores Kearns Goodwin's book was number two, and Bill O'Reilly
Yeah.
was number seven. And I just thought, there was the cave. I
Yeah.
entered the cave,
Sure
and
did.
there is the treasure. So,
So listen, I mean, this is so fascinating. Yeah, you're man, I want to encourage you to get on that documentary. It really should be a movie, but let me say this.
well,
And,
that's a whole nother story. But
yeah,
yes,
and let me stay true to my podcast, Grow Yourself. And the first time I've ever done this. So I'm going to do two things. One, and I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. So if you're listening to this, particularly on YouTube, please put in the comments what lessons come out of this amazing story that CV wrote about. I mean, as I'm listening, I'm just thinking there's so many lessons that come out of it. And I would love to hear what people think are the lessons. And now I would like to ask you, CV, what is one or two
Hmm?
lessons that you believe that you pass on to our listeners are lessons that come out of Mrs. Orcutt's story?
Oh, resilience. Because when you read her life story and the tragedies, and I think that one of the reasons I bonded with her is because she led a life of different type of trauma, but in many ways the same. She didn't have a life of childhood trauma,
Mm-hmm.
but all of the people in her life basically pass away.
Mm.
I have been through that myself. You are talking to a family reunion right now. All of my family has passed. I am the only one left. So every
Wow.
day I'm my own family reunion. Okay. And I don't say that in the woe is me, break out the
No,
violins
no.
moment. Okay. But she went through that also. She lost her spouse. I'm widowed. I lost my spouse years ago. She reminds me a lot of my grandmother. My grandmother was a very strong, had a lot of fortitude type woman. And So resilience is one of the lessons,
And let me
and
clarify
not
that.
not giving up. Yeah,
Yeah, so
go ahead.
that there's that. But when you say resilience, then you mean to develop the ability to
The
bounce
ability to
back.
keep going despite
Yeah.
adversity,
Yeah.
I mean, you lose all of your family, and it could, you can either, end your life in a bottle, drinking yourself to death. You can end your life. Sadly, people choose that, which I think is terrible. That you can just give up and sit and become a couch potato for the rest of your life and live in depression and wear a black veil for forever. Or you can choose, to go on. I describe
Mm.
my family loss and especially the widowing process that I went through as the best, worst experience. Worst for the obvious reasons. Okay. Losing a spouse, terrible. I lost to cancer and it was terrible to go through. But when I say the best, worst, what I learned out of going through the process of being, you know, pre-widowing and then finally when passing, and the man that I am today as opposed to the man then, I would have never gone in the cave had I not been through
Mm.
the widowing
Mm.
process. Now, that's not to say that, I'd
Right.
love to have my wife back and so on, but
Sure.
I may have gone through the cave for some other reason down the
Sure.
road.
Sure.
But I've got a life to share. Why not? What am I going to do? I don't have kids. I don't have family. So share my world with,
Love it.
even though I've raised 20,000 kids in the classroom and I'm
Hmm.
happy to have done it and it's been a noble job. The two most noble acts I think I ever did was marrying my wife and taking care of her, and then, helping to raise kids and become a positive, role model in the classroom and being a father figure to a lot of these big, and that goes along with mentoring and all that other
Sure.
stuff too.
Sure.
But, never giving up is another
Yeah.
lesson besides resilience and not
Yeah.
quitting because, yes, life will beat you down. Things will not go. And it's
Hmm.
not supposed to be perfect. It's not supposed to be
Hmm.
rainbows and sunshine all the time. There is, to every hill, there's a valley, all that kind of, again, maxims and truisms. These things keep going on and on and on in life where we keep hearing these comments that and they're there because they're true.
They're true.
I don't want it to be sunny all the time because I need some rain to make the garden grow,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
That's right.
So
No.
there are days when you need the
Hmm.
cycle of life, and I'm
Yeah.
very much informed myself by, some of the Eastern philosophies of, kind of Shintoism, Buddhism. I wouldn't call myself a Buddhism or Shinto, but the concepts in Wu Wei of acting with action without action, bending, looking at nature, bending with the trees, just
Yeah.
as we have to bend in life, flow
Beautiful.
like the river, just as we have to flow in life. Those
Beautiful.
are all very, very much what are important for people. But there's hope, and find a mentor, find somebody. Go
Gosh.
out and look for whatever it is you need, and don't be afraid to knock on a door. And because that door just might open, and it might be the cave door that opens, and suddenly you're,
Yeah.
you know,
When I was in the military and we were in some kind of military training, particularly if we had to take a test or something like this, like at leadership school after a course of whatever, the instructors we liked were the ones that would kick the podium when when he was trying to say this is one of the answers to the question. So it was a cue to us, and if you, and you knew it if they went, we were like, okay, pay attention to that because that's going to be on the test. That's what CV you just did here is this you just kick the podium and say, listen, that's one of the real questions and answers to life. What you just said,
Mhm.
so beautifully said. Please share, probably got another 10 minutes or something like this. Please, if you will, CV, share some of your other books. I want to see if I can just quickly scroll here some of the titles. Okay, and if I may, then let me just ask about middle finger management. That got my attention.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a sarcastic read. It's nothing like the Workut book at all,
Right.
because again, being kind of a brand Renaissance man and interested in random things. I've had a series of life, as we all have, at different times. Really bad employment experiences, maybe some bad bosses,
Yeah.
and I just one day the term just literally popped into my head, and again, call it a God thought, call it the universe speaking to
It's a
me.
billboard, whatever it is.
And
Yeah.
I just thought, man, that is middle finger management right there. And I thought, wow, I should write a book about that. And again, I kind of molded over in my head for a few months because I thought, what kind of book is it going to be?
Yeah.
Because anytime you come up with a topic, you can be social commentary, it can be a thriller, I mean, it could be anything. And so I thought, yeah, I kind of want a book. So, it's kind of a self-help guide, social commentary. There's a book that came out a few years ago. I don't want to say it on your podcast,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah. No,
called
I know
Unhappy
Yeah. Yeah.
Self.
Yeah. Yeah. About
Yeah,
the
it
F.
has a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, they put the
Yeah.
little asterisk and all that stuff.
Yeah.
That book, yeah, that was pretty well received. But because the cover, Amazon didn't want to advertise the cover, so that didn't quite get the same promotional push that I would have wanted. I could
Yeah.
change the cover if I wanted, but I designed the cover, and frankly, I like the cover. So even if it doesn't sell as well, whatever. But it's so apropos. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was just kind of me ranting about bad management and
Yeah.
how to get through bad management. And there is hope.
And so the idea is that there are, I would assume, lessons as to how to essentially operate in, let's say, a company or a business, sort of with, uh, given fingers to to management type of a thing, but of course it's obviously a metaphor, if you will.
Well,
The art of not giving an
yeah, it's
F
it's
is the one you're talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And then yeah, it is. I mean, there's a lot of middle finger managers out there,
Hmm.
who, are just people who should not be managing. but they got into a position of management. They're not skilled. They don't have the interpersonal communication skills. They don't understand the dynamics of people's, pride and emotions and things like that. And sometimes they're more focused on their own trajectory of career than they are on the people underneath them. And so those become the middle finger managers.
Oh,
And
so
those are the people who,
they're okay, gotcha. Yeah.
yeah, they kind of give you the middle finger,
Yeah.
So yeah,
Fair enough.
that's
I
the
get that.
concept.
No, that's really cool. And then there's the Chinese room. Now, has that one actually come out already
Chinese Room, I'm glad you asked about it because it comes out November, I mean, excuse me,
in
September
September, I
1st, just
think,
in a few
right?
weeks here.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
First of all, title.
September 1st.
Talk
Well,
about that.
I'm fascinated with what's called thought problems and thought experiments, and people have, heard things sometimes like the prisoner's dilemma and
Hmm.
the trolley problem and things. And thought experiments or thought problems, the same thing, are basically conundrums that are perhaps unanswerable. Maybe some people come to a decision that they are answerable, but the Chinese room is a thought problem that basically states, if you were inside of a room and had no access to anybody except for a tiny little mail slot, and I was on the outside of the room and you didn't know who I was, and I slid a piece of paper in with a bunch of Chinese characters on it, you would get this piece of paper when you're inside the room. You would read this piece of paper, the Chinese characters. And if you didn't speak Chinese, you wouldn't know what it said. But if you had some kind of book inside or, a chart that could help you decode what that was, you could then read my message, translator basically. And then you could write a reply back in the Chinese lettering and send it right back out. And, never knowing whether each of us inside the room or outside the room understood Chinese or whatever. So it gets into computer theory and, AI definitely, which is how the book, was kind of, it's a thriller.
Mm.
And it's a series, so each one of the books in the series is a different thought problem that continues on the story. And, in the Chinese room, how it applies to computer technology, for instance, is, when you're typing into your keyboard, and you're giving input and your computer is giving you back output, is it really understanding or is it just translating, algorithmically? Which, on a keyboard in a basic laptop and a PC or something like that, is pretty obvious that your computer does, your laptop doesn't really understand you as a person. But now that we're getting into artificial general intelligence, and now I think we're very close to artificial superintelligence. I think closer than most people,
I
maybe
have to
within the next
agree.
6 months, a year, if we're not already there, but maybe that's being kind of hidden how close we are. Um, where computers are really thinking for themselves and making decisions for themselves.
Yeah.
And then you become, is what you're inputting into ASI or
Yeah.
AGI, is it truly being understood or is it simply spitting stuff back? But it comes from a thought problem by a man named John Searle in the 1980s. I believe he proposed the concept,
Of
but,
AI.
and then yeah,
Yeah, I think
well,
a British guy. Is he a
I
British
believe,
guy?
yeah, he's British.
Is he the
Yeah.
one now warning about AI? I don't know if that's
No,
him or
Searle,
not.
I believe John Searle's passed, I believe.
Oh, I see.
But yeah,
Okay.
Searle. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And then the second book is the trolley
Yeah.
problem, and the third book is
Yeah.
called the Ship of Theseus. After that, and there's going to
So,
be eventually more than
so a couple of things just about this. One, um, what do people learn from that book or the series as it relates to, let's say, problem solving? Is that an appropriate question?
that.
You know,
Yeah. Well, I think the thing you learn from thought problems in general is
thought
that,
problems. Yeah.
yeah, thought experiments or thought problems is to think. It sounds kind of odd that, what are you going to learn is how to think, but, especially being a teacher, not every kid and certainly not every adult today has critical thinking skills. So thought problems can teach critical thinking skills. One of the easiest ones is what's called the trolley problem, which is the second book that I'm almost finished in the series. You're on a trolley and it goes either left or right. It splits off into two directions.
Hmm.
And the trolley problem, and again, people could type in Chinese room thought problem on YouTube and watch little video tutorials. There's some great tutorials.
Hmm.
But if you go one way on the trolley track, you're going to kill five prisoners who have committed murder. But if you go the other way on the trolley track, you risk killing a surgeon who is the only person that can
Wow.
perform a certain type of heart-saving surgery or whatever it
Wow.
is. Okay. So how do you make what decision? They're ethical problems. Thought problems and thought experiments are ethical problems. They're philosophical problems. They're moral problems. And, and then people start to change up things like the trolley problem. They say, okay, well, now you've got, three surgeons on this, but and you've got Mother Teresa on the other one, that kind of thing. Well, we know which one do you choose?
Right.
Well, in essence, they're unsolvable problems. You don't want to kill anybody, but
But if
you
you
do
have to
have to
make a
think about,
decision, you have to
and we
think
all
through
have to
it.
think, yeah, we
So have
do.
you ever heard of the
Maybe not that dire, but yeah.
have you ever heard of the thought experience experiment called nuclear bomb shelter?
I've heard
Oh,
of it. Yeah, I
yeah.
haven't included it in the series,
I
but
use it in workshops. I'm going to send it to you. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it's a fascinating one. You're going to
mhm,
love this one. I mean, 100% love this one. It's that way.
mhm.
Okay.
Sure.
So CV, what was the other question I was going to ask you relative to the Chinese room? Yeah, just about AI. I mean, just, give me your 30-second pitch about what you think about AI and its future. I completely agree with you. Even some of the most learned AI scientists out there are all saying this is all going to happen. Well, first of all, it's happening much quicker than we thought, and for good reason when you at least just under the basics understand the basics of AI. But what is your 30-second pitch about AI? Mean, anything, what we should do, or whether what do you think it'll happen, or will computers actually be able to
Well,
think for themselves?
yeah. Well, one of the reasons I'm fascinated with thought problems in general, and which relates to AI in the Chinese room, is that I'm I'm not so much interested in the AI techie side of it, I
Yeah,
don't coding and things like that. But I'm more fascinated with the philosophical, the ethical, issues with it. And I think for me, the what your 30-second, statement about it is that AI is one of the greatest thing, and probably the greatest thing to hit humanity since the printing press. But, it has the potential for obviously some very negative things because it's all based on, who's training it originally. And, now they're talking about AI is training itself where it's creating its own content and training itself off of its own content, which is interesting.
yeah,
But I think the thing that I'm not hearing talked about with AI, uh, and maybe I'm wrong, is there's going to be a part of AI and AI technology and integration into society that we can't even imagine yet. So we can talk about what we know in the static, sense of it, but in the dynamic sense, a year from now, we may be talking about something that didn't even exist. And I liken it to this, 20, whatever it is, 25 years ago, I remember probably 20 years ago when YouTube started, or Facebook or any of the social media stuff. Before then, there was nothing. We didn't even know to talk about streaming video. We didn't even know to talk about sharing social media or being an influencer wasn't even a career. And
right,
now it's the norm. So
right.
right now we're dealing with AI as we know it. But next year, 5, 10 years, there may be a whole another set of AI issues, standards, problems, successes, opportunities that we can't even calculate right now. We can, maybe abstractly
Yeah.
theorize.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I did some work for NASA down in Cape Canaveral, and one of the fascinating guy, I can't find him anymore, but he was an engineer with NASA and just also a historian. He took me to the museum and showed me this one thing where it showed, I think it was Apollo 11 or something like this, and he basically looked at me and said, "Kevin, that cell phone you have in your hand is X number of times greater than what they had in the entire technology
Mhm.
to put this into space." It was just crazy to hear him say something like that.
Well,
But what
yeah, I mean that's yeah.
what
It's
would
kind
you
of like the
say
gene,
that
the
yeah, the
just for a
genius of it
second.
all?
It's kind of like the Star Trek Gene Roddenberry. He was
Right.
using the Star Trek tricorder and the communicator and beaming up Scotty. That
Yeah.
that guy was so far thinking at the head of time.
Yeah.
And now
Yeah.
it's the norm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What will in And you're probably right to not predict, but let me just ask this, what will AI never be able to do? I would have said thinking
Well,
for a while, but not anymore.
well, I mean, in a physiological sense, it's never going to be able to bleed. I mean, maybe you're going to have
Yeah.
AI robot that has a hydraulic line in it that bleeds out, but it's not going to be in the same sense. So we're not going to have that kind of. And I don't know that it can experience, pain in the same way that we can, it can simulate. So, but
Will it
then it
have a
gets into the whole
conscience, though?
conversation.
Will it have a conscience?
I think it will have its own conscious, but it all depends on what we as people define. Like what is, it's like saying
Yeah.
sentience, if something alive,
Yeah.
what is being alive? To me,
Yeah.
you and I being alive as human beings is one thing, but an AI computer being alive, we may have to develop a concept of being alive. Do
Yeah.
computers get rights? If AI becomes, what they're talking about AI agents now and doing things, do AI get civil rights in the future? You know?
It's crazy to even think
There's a
about that.
whole, that's the
Yeah.
ethicist part that
Yeah.
I'm fascinated
Yeah.
with.
Well, listen, we only have a few more minutes left. I don't know if there's another book you would like to mention, and then I want to make sure we have enough time for you to tell everybody where they can find all your great, great works. So, whatever we don't talk about today in terms of your book, I know it's on your website because I've been there a couple of times. Is there another book that you'd like to mention here and talk about, again, what
Yeah.
value it might bring? Please do.
Yeah, there is it's another historical narrative, much like the Orcutt book. It's called Searching for Bowlby, and it's the study
Mm.
of the life of a man named John Bowlby. And most people are familiar with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in the psychology and the psychiatric world, but they're not familiar with John Bowlby's name. And I am
I'm not.
fascinated with what Bowlby developed, which is called attachment theory. So basically the concept of how we interact with our primary caregivers from zero when we're first born to about the age of 2 is how we form relationships later on. So if you're living in a kind of an abandoned orphan state from 0 to 2, you're going to have very probably dysfunctional relationships later on and so on.
Hmm.
And Bowlby lived from the early 1900s and died in 1990, 91. I'm blanking right now. And he developed the whole theory of attachment theory, which is a big part of psychology today. And there are therapists who specialize in psychology. If you type in attachment theory on YouTube, it's huge. There's a lot of dating coaches who are involved in using attachment theory.
Interesting.
And attachment theory really explains how we bond with people.
Oh,
And
man.
there's four short version. You're either anxious, you're avoidant, according to Bowlby's theory, you're disorganized or completely dysfunctional, or you're normal or secure.
Hmm.
So, you fit into one of those according to the theory. And, there's some people who've now taken, attachment theory and say, well, there's kind of subcategories. But, you know people yourself who are either maybe very anxious. Well, they probably had an anxious attachment style when they were first born and how they were raised. Maybe you know some people who are avoidant. You try to talk to them, ask them about their feelings, and they'll just avoid everything. Then you've had some people who, tend to be more disorganized and are kind of out there, and maybe you don't want to deal with them at all. And then you've got people who are raised well, they got secure parents, everything was positive, and so
Yeah.
on. So
That,
I
yeah.
became fascinated in my own, because I've been to therapy in the past, and I became fascinated with attachment theory. And then I thought, somebody should write a book about Bowlby's life, and people did, and they wrote them right after he passed away in the 90s.
Interesting.
And but the problem is they were very academic, textbooky kind of
I see.
stories, and they were
I see.
they were kind of dry.
Mm.
And I thought I really want to see a sweeping historical narrative. I want to see Bowlby's life on the big screen, which again, we mentioned the Orcutt book. I'm already writing the screenplay, and I'm already shopping that to Hollywood, and there's some ads that are going
That's
out and some trade
fascinating.
payments for Orcutt.
Absolutely
So I'd
fascinating.
like to
Yeah.
see Bowlby's story brought to the screen also, because
Yeah.
he's and I call it searching for Bowlby because he's kind of forgotten. Again, people know Freud, they know Jung, but Bowlby's not, and he's a titan. I mean, within the psychological field, he's very well known, but
Yeah.
most people in common, day to day, don't really know Bowlby. So, searching for Bowlby, I think, is going to be a good book, and I'm
Yeah.
very happy with it's done. I just was thrilled with how it came out. So,
Gosh, that's
I put a
fascinating,
lot of
man.
work into that one.
You know, I
Yeah, and that
I
was.
I read a lot of stuff. I don't read much novels and stuff. I'm so busy just reading the stuff that that really appeals to me, but all of your titles are so intriguing. I'm going to spend some time on your books. I really am, and I hope others will do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely, CV. So, would you please, share, and I know we're going to do this again, but I hope so. I hope you'll do it with me again. But would you please share with our audience where people can find you, where they can get your information, spend, what's
Sure.
next on your plate, whatever you'd like to say. I'd love for you to just take a
Yeah.
minute to do that.
Well, the easiest way is cbwooster.com, and it has all my social links, and there's some QR codes you can even, use your camera to pick up on. For if you're interested in the Orchid book, it's mrsorchidsdriveway.com. I bought the domain because nobody else
Hmm.
did, and I thought so it was a good book marketing way. And I don't own the property out there. I have no affiliation with whoever owns the property today. But there's tons of book info on mrsorchidsdriveway.com. There's
Yeah,
searchingforbulby.com, the
yeah.
Chinese Room Book.com, not just the Chinese Room, but the Chinese Room Book.com. I have a page for that too. So I have, pages for all my books. And then, all the standard socials, Instagram, Facebook are all CB at CB Wooster.
And that's
So yeah,
Wooster. Yeah, you
correct.
can't quite see it
Yeah,
because
just
your head's blocking the full name, but that's it right there. And so just
yeah, I
there it
know.
is.
There you
Yep,
go.
everybody can find you there.
Yeah.
Well, listen, anything else that you'd like to just add is, uh,
No, just I want to thank you. It was a great opportunity, great
yeah,
conversation. As I said, you're a
yeah,
great interviewer. I love talking to you, and I'm
sure.
happy to come back if you'll have me. And
Absolutely.
I've got the Chinese rooms coming out, and then Bowlby comes out October 1st, and then
Yeah.
there's a kids book that's coming out called The Clockmaker's Apprentice that comes out in November.
Hmm.
So, but whether we're talking about books or whether we're just talking about human growth and development or whatever it is, which is what you guys are all about there, it's your channel.
Hmm.
I just want to make people's lives better,
Yeah.
take the inspiration, realize that somebody who failed miserably many times, who had businesses that failed, who lost all of his family,
Yeah.
who went through all sorts of trauma as a child and so on, and
Yeah.
abuse, succeeded.
Yeah.
And they can too. There's no reason. It is
Well,
simply attitude, fortitude.
your mantra of, leaving people better than when you meet them, that's such a practical and achievable intention for anybody. I mean, you run into somebody at the coffee shop. It's a beautiful thing to carry around in your head that even if it's a 30-second conversation, wouldn't it be nice if we, yeah, left that person just a hair better off than when you met them? I think it's a beautiful way
And
to
you
approach
and you
life.
mentioned the key word, living
Hmm.
your life with intention. You
Yes.
intend to succeed, you intend to write a
Hmm.
book, you intend to
Hmm.
start a business, you live your life, you intend to make people's lives better, live with
Hmm.
intention. And, too bad so many people
Yeah.
don't, you
Yep.
know.
Yep.
So hopefully they'll get something out of this.
Brother CV Wooster. Wow, what a pleasure it was. I mean, I knew it was going to be a good conversation, but you exceeded it. And frankly, I appreciate your compliment, but it's not very difficult to have a great conversation with a guy like you, and I appreciate you a lot.
Kind words, my friend. And Kevin, I
Yeah.
consider you a friend. And you and I talked recently, I said, I will never not know you. And that's another thing I tell people. From now on, I can never unknow you. I will never not know you. And that's a blessing to my life. And I consider you a friend. And I hope to meet you in person someday. And I just thrilled to be able to be here. So, yeah,
Yeah,
thank you for the opportunity.
completely my pleasure. So look forward to chatting again soon.
Sure. Thanks. Bye, everybody.